This is going to be an attempt to share with you a possible insight of what I think consciousness is. Well, actually, this is going to be take 2 of a video that I already made, but in which I didn't speak. And this time I'm going to speak, which is more nice than just reading words. Listening is more interesting, I guess. So, I'm going to try to make this as simple as possible. First of all, I'm going to show you a picture with an object. So here we have a brown bottle. Now the reason why you can't perceive the bottle is because there is a clear difference between the bottle itself and the background in which it is manifesting. In this case, the background is just a white space or a white field. Now, if the bottle itself were just as white as the background, you wouldn't be able to perceive it anymore. The bottle and the background would merge together and it would become invisible for your eyes. So, the most important word here is contrast. There is a contrast between the bottle and the background. The reason why you can't perceive anything at all is because of contrast. Every phenomena that catches your attention is being perceived because that phenomena is distinguishable from everything else. In other words, it stands in contrast with everything else. So the reason why you are able to focus on the bottle is because it stands in contrast with the background. But if the bottle were just as white as the background, you wouldn't be able to focus on anything. Okay? Now, since you are able to focus on the bottle, that means that you are conscious of it. You can only be conscious if you are able to focus on something. So you need contrast in order to be conscious. Within unconsciousness, there are no contrasts. That's why consciousness and reality perfectly go together, because reality is infinitely filled with contrasts. Literally everything stands in contrast with everything else. Now anyway, back to the bottle. So as you can see right now, I have drawn a red line around the bottle. That red line marks the separation between the bottle and the background. The red line represents where precisely the contrast is taking place. So what I mean is, the red line represents where the transition between the background, where the transition between background to bottle is taking place. Like this. So the transition is the place where the background starts to change into the bottle. And so that's where the contrast is taking place. That's exactly where the bottle and the background are separated from each other. That's where the separation is taking place. And so my point is that the transition is also responsible for your consciousness. The place where the bottle and the background are separated from each other is responsible for you to be able to focus on the contrast between the bottle and the background. Now let's go a bit deeper. Let's make this more abstract in terms of duality and non-duality. So, since there is a contrast between the bottle and the background, there is a duality. If there is a contrast, there is a duality. If there are no contrasts, then it's non-duality. It's that simple. So let's replace the bottle with a plus symbol and the background with a minus symbol, like this, just to point out the duality. Now, my next point would be that the red line represents non-duality. Plus and minus are dualities which are separated by non-duality. The red line is perfectly balanced between the bottle and the background. And since the red line is responsible for you being able to focus on the contrast between the bottle and the background, that means that your focus is balanced between the bottle and the background. So again, the reason why you are conscious of the bottle is because it is distinguishable from the background, and the distinction is taking place right between plus and minus, the red non-dual line. So your consciousness is balanced between plus and minus. Your consciousness is taking place between every contrast. And my ultimate point would be that your consciousness is precisely non-duality itself. Your consciousness is centered or balanced in between every plus and minus. Now let's go even deeper. If we zoom into an object, we will perceive more and more smaller details. Here is an image of a leaf when we look at it from a particular distance. And here is the same leaf when we zoom in. This is what we see. We are now able to perceive the individual cells of the leaf. Now notice that when you look at the leaf from a distance, you perceive it as a continuity. You perceive it as one object. But if you zoom in, you perceive a bunch of individual cells. And each cell is one individual object. So when you zoom in, you perceive a bunch of individual objects. Whereas when you perceive the leaf from a distance, you perceive all those cells as one big single object. All those individual cells become a continuity from a distance. Now look at this. So I have been drawing once again red lines that marks the contrast between an object and its background. And once again, the place where the object is being distinguished from the background is the place that will be responsible for your ability to focus on that object. If there was no distinction between the object and the background, there would simply be nothing to perceive, and you would be unconscious of the object. So anyway, what I want to point out is the more we zoom into the leaf, the more distinguishable perceptions there will be. and the more red lines I will have to draw. Whereas if we zoom out and perceive the leaf from a distance, we won't be able to perceive the individual cells anymore, and so we would be unable to distinguish those cells. Instead, we would perceive the leaf as one continuity instead of perceiving it as a bunch of individual cells. Now, you can imagine that if we continued to zoom in even further, we would perceive even smaller objects within the cells of the leaf. You know, all the different kinds of organelles and so forth. And so we would be able to distinguish all of those objects. So basically our consciousness infiltrates into an object as we are able to make more and more distinctions inside of that object. As we are able to perceive deeper and deeper into an object, our consciousness infiltrates into that object and it becomes more and more filled with our consciousness, right? I mean, if we look deeply into something and we focus really hard on it, we will become more conscious of it. We will be able to detect more and more subtle nuances, and so we sort of penetrate the object with our consciousness. And the purpose of consciousness is like to infiltrate reality, to be able to sink into deeper and deeper layers of reality. And as we sink deeper, it's like as if we are cutting reality into pieces with our consciousness. So when you perceive the leaf as a whole from a distance, you perceive it as one continuity, and you are not yet able to perceive the individual cells. So your consciousness is not able yet to sink deeper into the leaf. It's not able yet to become conscious of more subtle distinctions. So it will kind of be stuck at the surface of the leaf. It can't sink into the leaf. But when you put the leaf under a microscope, you will be able to sink deeper into the leaf since you are able to perceive a lot more subtle distinctions. And so it's like as if your consciousness is literally falling through these red distinction lines, entering a deeper level of reality. Here is another visual representation of what I'm trying to explain. So at the top, we start with an object that looks like a continuity when you look at it from a distance. Now, the more closer you observe it, the more stuff you will be able to perceive within that object, and therefore the more distinctions you will be able to become conscious of. Now, theoretically, if you continue to do this forever, so if it is possible to make an infinite amount of distinctions, you will eventually end up with a pure continuity of distinction itself. You will end up with a pure continuity of distinction itself. So you can see this as some kind of infiltration system in which you start at the top and you slowly sink into deeper and deeper levels of consciousness. Eventually you will become so conscious of so many distinctions that your consciousness will form a continuity. All those distinctions will form a continuity. And so at this point, the initial object at the top of the infiltration system is completely absorbed by your consciousness. And so what will happen is you won't experience it anymore as some object, but you will experience your own consciousness completely. So the object will disappear and the only thing that will be left is your own consciousness. And this is also enlightenment, pure, infinite consciousness. So what I believe is that consciousness is the thing that separates reality into distinct objects and phenomena. Because without distinctions, there would be nothing to become conscious of. So we have to precisely focus on the thing that separates each object. You know, where precisely does the bottle begin and the background begin? Where precisely does the separation take place? And if you look deep enough, you will realize that you are looking for separation itself. You are not looking for some kind of ultimate physical boundary that separates two objects from each other. No, the boundary is not a physical thing. It's precisely the act of becoming conscious of something. It's separation itself. But separation itself is not a physical thing out there in reality. Separation itself is literally consciousness itself. It's literally you. You are literally in between every phenomena that you become conscious of. Yes, that's what I'm arguing for. Is consciousness inside the brain? Well, why is it that you can perceive the brain? Because you can distinguish it from everything else. Is consciousness inside your thoughts? Well, why is it that you can perceive your thoughts? Well, because you can distinguish them from everything else. You see, whatever your answer is, you have to ask the question, why is it that I can perceive this answer? And the answer will always be because you are able to distinguish it from everything else. That's the basis. To become conscious of something is to be able to distinguish it. And that's more fundamental than the brain. You know, it all starts with the ability to distinguish something. You have to be able to distinguish the brain in the first place. So what is responsible for distinguishing the brain? Well, you might say the brain itself. The brain is able to distinguish itself. But what is distinction itself? Notice that you cannot notice that you cannot distinguish distinction itself. Or in other words, you cannot separate separation itself. So what is separating everything from everything else? Of course, it's separation itself. But what is separation itself? Well, that's the paradox. You can't separate separation itself, or you can't distinguish distinction itself. So it's impossible to observe it. Now, if the brain is responsible for separating everything from everything else, such that you can become conscious of distinguishable phenomena, then the brain itself must be separation itself. It must be distinction itself. But that's not possible because the brain itself is perfectly distinguishable. The brain is perfectly perceivable. Everything that you can perceive is perfectly distinguishable. But the thing is, we're looking for distinction itself. And of course, distinction itself is not distinguishable, so we are not able to perceive it in any way with our senses or with any kind of measurement devices. So I believe that distinction itself is consciousness itself. It is the direct sense of being, and it's impossible to separate yourself from your being. If you separate yourself from your being, you will die. So you literally are distinction itself. Anyway, that's it for now. This theory is still incomplete. Maybe I have made some interesting points. Maybe it's total bullshit. I don't know. But this is how my brain thinks about consciousness for now. Right now. So I will see you in the next video. Thanks for listening. See ya.